and open up your little sticky note, okay? So you will have a number on there, probably a percentage. I may not have written the percentage sign on some of them. This represents a percentage that in this little activity you were born into. You were born into this socioeconomic group. So does anyone have 2%? Hey, guess what? You're rich. You're upper class.
Oh, slay.
Your family makes $153,000 or more a year.
What do you have?
Okay, anyone have 14? Ah, congrats. You are upper middle class. Your family makes between $94,000 and $153,000 a year. Not bad, not bad. Does anyone have 38? Okay. You are middle class. You're not doing bad. Your family makes between $58,000 and $94,000 a year. Does anyone have 35? Okay, you two are lower middle class. Your family makes between $30,000 and $58,000 a year. Does anyone have 11?
Sounds about right.
Does anyone have 11?
I have 14. I don't know if you called that one yet.
14 was upper middle class.
Oh, okay.
Does anyone have 11 at all? Okay, if you had 11, you would be the lowest of the classes. Okay, that's $30,000 or less a year. So, let's see. Raise your hand again for 2%. 14%. 38%. 35%. And no one had 11. Okay, so those different amounts, those different classes, and the income levels, what do you think the difference is for the people who were born into that class level? What is their difference in the outcome of their life? What's going to be different between them? They all have the same chance at everything?
Opportunity.
Okay, what type of opportunity? Give me more.
For like the 2%ers, most of those are born from or into trust funds and from billionaires and CEOs. With the middle class, it's just like born people around here. You're not going to have the same opportunities.
That's correct. So different opportunities because like, hey, they've got money set aside for your college before you're even born, or your family's struggling to make ends meet, right? Big difference there. Do they have different levels of education outside of college? Is the school system in Palo Pinto and Mineral Wells the same as the school system in upstate New York?
Probably should be.
Yeah, we want
Probably isn't.
education equality, right? We want everybody to have equal access to a good education. But one of the big factors is what type of income area are you in? If your income area is very low income, you're not going to have a lot of resources when you go to school. Whereas if you're in the middle of a big city, you're going to have a lot more resources. You're going to have after school stuff, extracurriculars, you're going to have clubs, and all this stuff that we sit here and go, man, I wish we had, right? So just something for you to think about as we start talking about Chapter 13. Chapter 13 is about facing economic challenges, and we got three main things we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about unemployment, poverty, and inflation. So let's get started. So, what is unemployment? Anyone give me a definition?
Ain't got no job.
Being employed.
Not being employed, okay? So to measure unemployment, we use something called the unemployment rate. So, the unemployment rate is the percent of the labor force that is jobless and looking for work. That's one of the key things is they have to be actively looking for work. If they stop looking, if they give up, guess what? It doesn't count anymore. So, like I said, the things that don't count. Number one, you got The people who stop looking for work. Maybe they've been looking for a job for so long they're just exhausted. They think nothing's out there. They've lost hope. Have you known someone who was looking for a job and they just gave up? Maybe it's your uncle or your brother who sits on the couch all day and they're just like, nah, then it's not my fault I don't have a job, right? That's stereotypical. But. And the other thing is people who are underemployed. Have you ever heard that term before, underemployed? No?
Is that the same as like understaffed?
Similar, but not quite the same. So if you are underemployed, that means you want to work more, but you're not given that work. So if you have full-time availability, but they have you at part-time hours.
Okay.
Things like that are being underemployed. Or if you're highly skilled and you can't get into that industry for your skill, you're having to work a low-skill job. And so you make less money. So to find the unemployment rate, we divide the number of unemployed people by the total number of workers. And that gives us that information, right? Would you think that unemployment ever reaches 0%?
No.
No. There's never going to be a point where everyone is employed that can be employed, right? But a healthy level of unemployment for a country is going to be where the unemployment is not caused by a bad economy. So when you have normal unemployment instead of, oh, everybody got laid off because all the companies are failing. So there are actually some different types of unemployment that we're going to talk about next. 4 different types. I'll give y'all a second to finish writing. You got it? We're good? Okay, keep going. Types of unemployment. The first type is going to be frictional unemployment. I'm not going to write unemployment every single time because it's a long word. But frictional unemployment is the simplest, most basic, potentially the most healthy version, in my opinion, which is just you quit one job because you're starting another. Sometimes there might be a gap between, right? Maybe you have a couple weeks or a couple months off between one job and the next, but you're not actively searching for a job because you have one. There's nothing wrong with having a gap between. Then we have seasonal. Seasonal unemployment is because you hire workers for a specific season and then you fire them afterwards. They start that job knowing they're not going to keep it forever, most likely. Whenever I worked at Hobby Lobby, they hired me on to help with the Christmas rush, and they said, we don't know if you're going to keep working here. After Christmas, we'll have to see what you do. In the new year, we might fire you just because we hired you on for Christmas. And I lucked out, and I was one of the few people who got to stay. But that's a very common practice in retail, food service, agriculture, things like that. Then we have structural unemployment. So structural unemployment has more to do with a business, okay? This is when they have jobs, but the workers for them do not exist, or they don't have the skills that are needed. So if they have a job opening for a software engineer, but there's no one who's recently come out that knows the programs that's willing to work that job, okay? And it may be because the pay is too low, it may be because it's brand new technology or systems that they're working with, or they're just looking for people with a greater experience than is available. And lastly, there is cyclical unemployment. This is part of the business cycle. That's why it's cyclical. Okay? This is caused by a decrease in economic activity. So things like layoffs or when a business shuts down. It's because something negative is happening in the economy, which means those jobs go away. So the big bad negative one is going to be those cyclical unemployment. We have to cut back hours. We can't have as many workers as we do. Okay, but what does this do? What is the impact of unemployment? Okay, there's three big things. And it's like, oh, it's a shame that these things happen, but it's all because of unemployment. Okay, number one, it's inefficient when there is a large amount of unemployment. This is a waste of available labor and labor resources. Because in theory, in the perfect world, in the perfect economy, if there's a job and someone wants to work, they should be able to work. If someone is willing and able to work for money, they should be able to. That's not always how it works. Number two, inequality. People who are less skilled, they don't have as much education, or maybe they were the last one hired, the lower on the totem pole, metaphorically speaking, those are the first ones who get fired in most places, are they not? Yeah. So people who maybe they just don't have a college degree, or maybe they don't have a master's degree and only have a bachelor's. Those can be the people who are first fired, first lose their job because of that inequality in education. And lastly, unemployment can cause discouraged workers. I told you earlier about the uncle or the brother or whoever that sits on the couch and say, yeah, I'm unemployed, but I'm not looking for a job. It's people who lose faith in finding a job because it's not easy, especially nowadays. Has anyone looked for a job recently? You go online and you're like, oh, this looks interesting. This looks promising. Oh, they want a master's degree for an entry-level position. Oh, they don't pay enough to meet bills. Maybe it's not in this area. You have to drive all the way to Dallas for that job, right? So, that's unemployment in a nutshell. Let's move on to talking about poverty. Has everybody got this? Cool. Poverty. I said poverty in the last class, and they said, okay, that's just us. Maybe, maybe not, okay? So poverty, the definition of it is when you are lacking income and resources to achieve a minimum standard of living, okay? So it's not just, oh, I'm broke. It's, I can't pay for my basic needs. So there's something called the poverty threshold. We might call this the poverty line as well. Same basic idea. Which the United States says there's this official number that is the minimum amount of money that you need to take care of your bare necessities and get by. not living in the lap of luxury, but it gets food on the table just enough, not in excess. And according to my train of thought just left. I looked online to see what the poverty threshold was for this year, which is around $15,000. For a one-person household in 2024. So you can very quickly see if the only job that you can get is a part-time job, it may not pay for what you need to get by. We also have something called the poverty rate. Just like the unemployment rate is the percentage of people who are unemployed, the poverty rate is the percentage of people living in poverty below the threshold numbers. There are some specific groups of people that are more likely to live in poverty. Okay, and I'm not just talking about people who make less money. That's what someone said last period. What groups of people are more likely to live in poverty? Poor people. That's the definition of poverty. Try again. So who do you think? What groups of people?
Those in third world countries.
Okay, but let's talk about in the United States.
Oh, in the United States.
Any ideas?
People that live in Detroit.
How about minorities? What's a minority? Okay, by definition, a minority is someone from a group that there's less people, right? They're not the majority, they're the minority. Okay, so a lot of the time that's people of color or people who've immigrated or things like that.
It's gonna be racist.
I'm using the definitions of these terms. That makes them distinctly not racist. The other big group of people that are most likely to live in poverty is going to be children. Because when you think about kids who don't have a parent who provides for them, whether they're on their own or abandoned by their parent, and they're not quite at the age that they can go get a job and start working, or they have limited hours because they're still under the age of 18, right? That's going to cause a type of poverty that's hard to get out of. Okay, so children and minorities. As far as minorities, like I said, that can often include people from other countries who've come here. They don't necessarily have all the connections. They don't come with the greatest amount of money. So like my mom works at a school that has a lot of teachers who have come here internationally. And she literally gave them furniture because they weren't able to sit and eat a meal at a table in their tiny room that they shared with other people because they didn't have one. They came here for this job and they didn't have anything else. Okay, major factors in poverty. What is going on? Okay. Believe it or not, one of the main factors in poverty is going to be education. Why would education influence people's poverty level? Come on. Any ideas? Why would not having an education put someone in poverty?
You can't get a job.
Can't get a job, can't get a good paying job, right? If you have education, you have the ability to be a skilled worker, and skilled workers get paid more, right?
Can't really get a job without like a high school degree.
Yeah, most places you have to have a high school diploma or something equivalent, and that's like bottom of the totem pole jobs, bottom ranked jobs. Okay, anything more, you're looking at least an associate's, bachelor's. Some places are now requiring a master's degree to work there. So yeah, education's a big thing. Number 2, discrimination. When you look at the numbers, you look at the statistics, guess what group of people is the most likely to have a high-paying job?
White people.
White and male. Even people who are white women who are in the same workforce, in the same field as other white people, okay? Statistically, women make less money, okay? And there's a lot of factors that play into that. I'm not trying to push one agenda over another. That's just the numbers and how it sits right now. So discrimination, when they hire someone because they're a man and they feel more confident of that, because they're white and they feel more confident in that, that can impact how people of minorities, people who are women, they make less money. Okay, I even had someone in my last class period that said they and their brother work at the same place, or did at one point, and their brother made $5 more for the exact same job. So it's not like it doesn't exist around here. Next is demographic trends. When we talk about demographics, we talk about the amount of people and what they're doing, how they live, right? So a big thing, specifically since the 1950s, guess what? Less people are getting married, more people are getting divorced, okay? And you have a lot of people having kids without being married. We have an increase in single-parent households. Guess what? It's harder to get by with a single income, right? That's a big one. And then lastly, changes in the labor force. Back in the 1800s, early 1900s, what jobs did everybody have? What type of jobs? What were they doing?
When?
Back in the 1800s, early 1900s.
I know, like factory jobs.
Factory jobs. We're all making stuff. We're working in factories, losing our fingers and toes to make it happen, right? What?
Coming back to work that same afternoon.
Coming back to work the same day. You stitch it back up, wrap it up, go back to work, make your paycheck. Nowadays, what are most jobs?
Office jobs.
There's a lot of office jobs, but most jobs are retail or restaurant. They're service industry jobs. Okay, so there was a shift from manufacturing to the service industry, which has changed, the poverty rate and how people are able to make money, right? Okay, so how do we combat poverty? We know it's a problem. We know there's a lot of things that cause it, okay? We have programs set up to do so, right? We're going to call these anti-poverty programs. There's a lot of them, so get prepared. So the basic concept of an anti-poverty program is known as welfare, right? Welfare is when the government does something to help people in need. So here's some examples of welfare. In 1964, they came out with something called the Food Stamp Act. They put in place legislation to start giving out food stamps, okay? Little credits that you could use to get basic necessities for your family. So the Food Stamp Act is to prevent hunger and starvation. Then we have something called Medicaid. Anyone ever heard of that one? Medicaid is like health care coverage. Woo. And it's generally for, a lot of the time it's used for children, is what it's used for. Lost my place. There's also something called the Earned Income Tax Credit. The Earned Income Tax Credit is when you go to file your taxes and the government tells you, no, you don't make a lot of money. You know that money that you paid in for payroll tax? We're going to give it back to you to help you get by. And I'm not going to lie, when I was working retail, there were times where I got the Earned Income Tax Credit because I did not make enough money to get by, basically, was what the government said. There's also Social Security. Social Security is to help pay for the daily needs of retirees, survivors, and disabled people. They put this in place in 1935 with the Social Security Act. There's also something called the Community Service Block Grant Program. And this is where the government takes money and gives it to a local government to try and fix, help, remediate issues for that community. So a lot of the time it can be education programs. Maybe it's a special initiative to help people get their GED because they've dropped out of school. Or it can be things like, we're going to help the local library, we're going to do cleanup, different things to decrease the amount of poverty in an area can be funded through the Community Service Block Grant Program. And lastly, there's something called workfare, which is kind of like welfare, but you have to work for it. That's it. In order to get benefits, you have to do work. Kind of like when you're on unemployment, you have to prove that you are searching for a job, right? If they're sending you money. Okay, we understand poverty so far? It's kind of a really depressing lecture that we have today. Sorry, I didn't write it. The textbook writers did. Okay, next we have inflation. The big bad word, right? So, inflation is when prices rise or when the purchasing power of money falls. Either way, you can't buy as many goods and services with your money. There's a couple different ways that we measure this. Okay, there's something called the Consumer Price Index. The Consumer Price Index is a way that they measure the change of prices in goods and services over time. And the way they do this is the government takes a survey on the phone, online, whatever it is. And they say, okay, you, average people across the country, what are the basic groceries you buy every month? And they say, well, I buy milk, I buy bread, I buy eggs, maybe there's some other stuff. And then they say, okay, how much did you pay for it this month, next month, etc. And they take that information and they average it out across the states. And then they track it over the months and over the years. And they put it on a graph. And it shows the change in prices over time. And I think they started tracking it back in like the 1970s. So we have information from that period up until now showing how much prices have risen. Things like, well, you used to be able to buy a gallon of milk for 50 cents, and now it's $4.50. Or a loaf of bread used to be 10 cents, and now it's $1.50, right? We can see how inflation and price changes have happened over time. There's also something called the producer price index, which is the same concept, but it's for wholesale products. So things like raw materials, or when one business sells stuff to another business to put on their shelves, right? So what it takes to manufacture, or what it takes to stock a store, and it measures the changes of those prices over time in the same way. Now, economists use these two, CPI and PPI, to calculate the inflation rate. And that's just in general how prices change over time. And there's two specific terms we use to describe how they change sometimes. One is hyperinflation. And the other is deflation. Hyperinflation is when inflation is really bad. We're talking inflation rises by 50% or more a month. When was the last time we saw hyperinflation? Wasn't that long ago. Think about it. It's in your lifetime.
Was it COVID?
COVID, right? We saw all these prices jumping up really fast. And deflation is not as common. This is when there's a decrease in price, a decrease in the rate of inflation. And it's very rare that it happens. So, what causes inflation? Well, we said one of the last times hyperinflation happened was during COVID. What was it that caused the prices to change?
Everybody mass buying, really everything.
Water.
So
It's production.
demand was high and production was low, right? So that falls into our first category of inflation causes. The first category is called demand pull inflation. And demand pull comes from the total demand rising faster than production. So basically, there's a couple different ways it can happen. Is demand goes up, the producers aren't responding fast enough, so there's scarcity, and that causes the prices to go up because there's not enough to go around. Or the other option is that the government puts more money into the economy. And then there's more spending, which in turn causes the prices to rise. Because again, there's not enough to go around. The secondary type of inflation is called cost push inflation. So we have opposites, demand pull and cost push. Cost push inflation happens because there's an increase in the cost to produce products in some way, shape, or form. A lot of the times, this means that wages have gone up or that the cost of materials have gone up. This drives up production costs. And because it's more expensive to produce whatever it is, that means the prices go up. Kind of the easiest, simplest way that prices rise. If it's more expensive to make it, they're gonna have to sell it for more to make money. And then lastly, we want to talk about the impact of inflation. Okay, what does it do to the world around us? Everybody got this? So, the number one thing that inflation does is it decreases the value of a dollar. The literal definition of inflation is that your money is worth less. You have less purchasing power. But alongside that, it also increases interest rates. And lastly, it decreases your return on a savings account. So let's say I have a savings account and I make 3% back every year on that savings account. What happens when the inflation is 7% is that you don't actually make a lot of money off your savings account, right? Because if you take that 7% and subtract the 3%, your money actually lost value by 4%. So that's why it's important when you start finding places to put your money, savings account and things like that, you try and find a high yield one if you expect to increase the value of the money that you have in there. But that's what I have for you today. Tomorrow is testing, right? So you guys will most likely not be in here. In which case we'll pick up with vocab on Wednesday. And then on Thursday I have like a little game thing we're gonna play about inflation. So